Hi, and welcome to week 4. This week we're going to be looking at some history of typography, where it all started, and classifications. So all of the different fonts can be broken into different type classifications. It's based upon certain visual elements when they were created. Sometimes now, we're looking for a retro feel, so they may design a newer font based on principles that were popular back at a certain time. So you're already looking at the video. Let's go to handsetting type. I briefly talked about handsetting type last week, how we used lead for leading and typesetting. So here are a couple articles for you to read. The history of handset type. You're really going to see a lot of these letters in drawers and how they were organized. It's so interesting to watch videos because people got used to obviously where letters were. So here's the case, and how the letters are organized, where they are. 12-point illustrated. Typesetting by hand, so here's that case again, and this is a 12-point times Roman double lay case. So it would be specific for each font, for each point size, and then you'd lay it out, put it into place, and then again ink and stamp. Beginner's Guide to Leading, and then what is leading. So just kind of a recap on all of those things. Pretty interesting, cool to look at. Then we're going to get into a little bit of history and brief classifications. So font types, a designer's guide. Sort your serifs from your scripts and slabs from stencils with the guide to main categories of font. Now you're going to see this is their 4 main categories. I have a slight variation on this that we'll get to, but read about what makes each one the defining feature. Where is it used? Classic examples. You're going to see that we have standard, so fonts that are going to be installed on normal average computers. Then you're going to see there are thousands that you can download and install. People basically make fonts for very specific uses and then put them on the internet, etc. Brief history of typography and typefaces. So terminology explained. So we kind of looked at all of those vocab words so that you can see them being put to use. 1400s, Gutenberg invented movable typefaces, giving the world a cheaper way to obtain the written word. Up until this point, all written materials were done by hand, and it was very costly to purchase. Gutenberg also created the first typeface, black letter. It was dark, fairly practical, and intense, not very legible. So if we think about the history of typography, and again, Gutenberg in the 1400s, we can go back to 1600 BC, and they had symbols for the spoken sound, kind of like a Greek alphabet. So, and then, going through getting the Greek alphabet, we get our first handwritten book. This is really impressive, right? Because things and books and, they weren't making papers back then, but all of these things gave whoever could read them power, right? If I had the one and only book on math, let's say, everyone would have to come to me to know about math. So, the kings and queens would have these written materials. Granted, probably somebody else would be reading it and telling them all of the information, but then they could kind of be the holder of the knowledge, right? So as we go throughout time and books became more practical, or posters or signs and all this stuff, it opened up knowledge for people. So the Gutenberg Bible was made in 1454, and that was the first form of mass media, right? So people who wanted control would try to gain copies of the Bible, of these different books throughout time. But then, fast forward, we get to the Industrial Revolution in 1870 to 1950s, photosensitive transfers, and then digital typography in 1979. I would recommend that you kind of look through these. We're going to be looking at history more than just this week, but start to think of a timeline. Start to think of what came next. I would like for you to know dates, but it's not important. I don't need for you to tell me in, 1869. But think about what had to happen for that to progress and to get to where we are. All right. This is kind of just a more visual timeline for you. So the pictograms, hieroglyphics, Greek alphabet, first vowels, Gutenberg, here we are, all the way. Then we're going to get into classifications. So you're going to notice that if you look up font classifications, there's going to be a few different answers. So type classification. There are thousands of different typefaces and fonts available to designers, printers, publishers, artists, writers, as well as the general public today. They are all types of display and text typefaces and everything in between. Most are available in a digital format from a variety of type foundries that can be easily used and exploited with modern computer technology. The vast amount of type available makes specific classification of every one nearly impossible and somewhat frivolous. However, it is important to have an understanding of the basic styles of typefaces to help narrow down your research. So, this site breaks it down into black letter, calligraphy, serif, sans serif, script, pixel, decorative. Okay? Important to think of these. Black letter, remember we talked about this a little bit earlier with history. Serif, now serif, they break into old style and modern, which are going to be two that we're going to be dealing with. So just to go through this one. Type classifications, this is serif, sans serif, script, and decorative. So you'll see some repeating, and again, these like serif type styles and then old styles underneath, transitional. So there are subcategories for each one as well. This article is really interesting to think about how do we combine typefaces. So if I have an old style, what is going to look best with it? How can I use it? Which one's going to be my headline? Which one is going to be supporting? All of that. So they talk about 7 font families here, how to pair, contrast, classifications, etc. All right, and then we're going to get into our assignment. But before we do, I want to talk about the 4 classifications. I have 6, but we're going to use 4 for your assignment. But, okay, so old style. Here's an example of old style. I've done all of these where I just start with the name of the classification, an example of a font that is part of that classification in lowercase and in uppercase, so you can see the difference. Don't forget, if you are in Illustrator, you'll just go to Window, Type, and Character to bring up this window where you can pick your font choices here. The font family, meaning light, bold, italic, whatever comes with that font. All right, so old styles. Old style. Started in the 1400s, was based on hand lettering. So imagine a wedge tip pen writing all of these. Old style always has serifs. It's part of a serif font. So, again, when we look at different fonts, you can first easily decide, is this serif or is it sans serif? Then if you know it's serif, we can go through the classifications that are serif or, vice versa. The serifs on lowercase letters are generally on an angle. Now, with these classifications, and as I mentioned earlier, there's so many fonts designed so many different ways. You as a designer may say like, okay, I love old style, and in particular, I love Baskerville, so I'm going to make a font based on Baskerville, except I'm going to have my serifs on the second half of the alphabet be straight across, right? So I'm telling you that old style has the lowercase letters on an angle, but you may find that it doesn't always fit that way. So these are general classifications to look for, but there's always going to be outliers and, differences. Curved strokes have thick to thin transitions. So if we look at this S in particular, you can see how thick it is here, and how we get around to the top, it's thin. So thick to thin transitions. One of your vocab words was stress, right? That's a line between the thinnest parts. So we could draw a line straight up and down through the O. That is the stress here. Okay? Most of the time, in old style fonts, the stress is on an angle. This one, we have pretty up and down. Let's see here. Garamond, we've got, here we go. So Palantino is a good old style. You can see we've got our stress on a slight angle here. Okay. These were generally named for their designers, as are a lot of fonts throughout history, but kind of starting here is when that became popular. All right, so then we move into modern, talking like the late 1700s, early 1800s. So modern followed the old style. They wanted to be hip and get with the times and the mechanical age. So this has a more mechanical style. It doesn't have to follow that handwritten feel. It does still have serifs, but most of these are horizontal serifs. So you can see all of these are very straight across. This has a more radical thick to thin transition. As we can see, look at the difference between these different strokes. Very different. They tried to push that even further because, again, we're getting more with mechanical style, so we can do more contrast. It does feel a little cold, and modern is generally that way, but it is kind of elegant. So this one is Dodot. Bodoni and Onyx are other examples, just to get you started. All right, then we move to slab serif. Looking at it, right off the bat, and it's called slab, it is the thicker lettering. So with the Industrial Revolution came advertising, okay? We want to make the thicker. We want to make sure that people can read this from a far distance. There was very little thick to thin transitions. You can see just a little bit in some of the letters, but again, we wanted to be bold. We wanted to make statements. Clarendon is kind of the epitome of the style. If we look at the stress here, it's another vertical stress. So kind of getting away from the angles that were modern. It was overall dark. It was easy to read, but dark. It was common in children's books, and it was generally named from Egyptian references. All right, and then we go to sans serif. Again, sans means without. This was later to be developed. It was the early 20th century. Monoweight, so no thick to thin transitions. Obviously no serifs, so we were just dealing with the main letter forms. And this we have more, click on here. generally you have more options with your family inside. So bold, oblique, bold, regular, light. Now, again, throughout time, people have gone back and developed some of those, but it was more common now, starting in history and moving forward, to see all of the variety with each font. Optima is another good example, and that has a little bit of thick to thin, but the Bauhaus School of Design made those more popular. Okay, then we have like script, decorative, your calligraphies. These are hand lettered, there's lots of style. These are made to be fun, right? They're decorative. It's not made to be your book font. It's just if you're, doing something in particular, a headline for a wedding or something, you might get more decorative in those. Those came later in history when we had more freedom to actually design your font choices. Okay? So, what are we going to do with these? You're going to select 2 categories of type. Select a font that fits each category and write a brief history of it, including the type designer, reason for creation, ease of readability, unique attributes or characteristics, and you're going to have all of that on one artboard, and then you're going to use a second artboard to illustrate or display the typeface. So you'll have 2 AI or PDF files total. I want you to submit as a PDF, but if you're working in Illustrator, so you'll have 2 files because you're picking 2 categories. So let's say I pick slab serif and modern. Each one of those is going to have 2 artboards. So if you have any questions, let me know. The objectives. Recognize and understand specifics of 2 typefaces and begin to understand the complexity and subtle differences within the typefaces. Okay? We will be looking at these 4 main classifications. Script and decorative can be fun and interesting, but I want you to look at the basics first. Make sure your report is well organized and really shows in-depth knowledge of the font. Make sure to cite any sources. Your second artboard should be well designed. This should be a piece that can stand on its own. So you're really kind of thinking about graphic design in the second one. The first one, I would still design it, but it's more of just type history. And I have a couple examples, so I'll show you. So places to start, I wrote some fonts so you could take a look and see like what makes old style what makes modern, etc. All right. So I'm just going to show you a quick 2 examples here. So modern type Onyx, here's the history on it, the sources, and then Nirvana uses that font, so designed page to go into it. Futura, and then Futura, using the letters here and the designed page that speaks on its own. Okay, so this is all you're going to be doing for this week because it kind of requires you to research, write a small research paper, and design pages for each. So I want you to really take your time with this, look in the differences, read all of the websites I provided, and then have fun and design 2 pages. All right? And that's it. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you soon.